it is a very interesting phenomenon where global investors see that investing in China as a risk, but on the other hand, they don't take what the party says seriously. Over the past maybe 5 years, is whatever the party says that they're going to do, they have done.
I tell them it's like, don't fight the Fed.
Exactly.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Alvin. I'm the CEO of OPIM. This is Alpha Uncovered. We have a very special guest today, a good friend of ours, Mr. Stephen Luck, CEO of FountainCap Research and Investment, one of the longest running strategies on China long-only funds based here in Hong Kong. Stephen is the CEO of FountainCap and responsible for, obviously, the overall business, works really closely with the CIO and the team. He also works in formulating marketing and market strategies and sits on the investment committee. Prior to joining FountainCap, he was 10 years with Goldman Sachs in New York and Shanghai within its investment management division. He worked as an IMD corporate controller from 2007 to 2011, Harvard and Oxford grad, and he's been with the firm pretty much since inception. Is that right?
Pretty much, yes. And just a slight correction. I wish Harvard grad as well, but only Oxford grad.
Okay, Oxford grad. It's still top tier. Well,
yes.
It's good to see you, Stephen. Welcome back.
Thank you, Alvin. Thank you for this opportunity. It's always great chatting with you.
So I want to jump straight into almost a continuation of a lunch we had a couple of weeks ago. And it was really looking at this changing temperament in allocators and how they're looking at Asia, and in particular, China. So let me just set the stage here, right? So here we are. We're coming out of the last 3 years. Sino-US relations are in a brutal place right here. You have misinformation going back and forth, and a massive dislocation between real GDP output in different economies versus their markets, right? Case in point, Japan's up almost 17% year to date. GDP just turned negative last month, right? The regulators there and the government is selling down dollars in order to help shore up the currency. Meanwhile, you have China, even if you don't believe their 5.5% GDP last year, even if you discount it in half, it's still outpacing every single G7 country in the world. Meanwhile, the CSI 300 is only up like 7%, 5 to 7% year to date. It's retraced a little bit. Hong Kong's doing a little bit better. We're up roughly about 17%, I think it is. At the peak, we're up over 20% from trough to peak. So setting the stage right now, here we are in a place where allocators are actually starting to come back. Right? In the last 2 months, I think between you and I, we probably hosted tens of investors who are looking really closely at making a play, partly because of the RV, the relative value of China and Hong Kong stocks, and secondly, perhaps for more fundamental reasons. So why don't you give me, your take right now? And in particular, you've just come back from a conference today, this afternoon, right? Talking about the geopolitical tensions, especially in the tech space. So go ahead.
Yes. Firstly, I have been telling this to all of our investors, and every time I go overseas to Europe, to US, and the Middle East, is we need to look at China from a trend perspective and not from an events perspective. Events come and go, and it changes all the time. And especially for a long-term investor, it's much more important to get the trend right and be on the right side of the trend so that you increase your chance of success, essentially. And if you look at China from that angle, over the past 50 years, there's actually been 13 other times where market cycles through peak to trough. And that drawdown is a lot more significant than what we have experienced over the past 2-3 years. But interestingly, every time after it hit rock bottom, the market sets a new high. So the overall trend in the past 50 years since China has opened up has always been upwards. In between, it oscillates quite a bit, and those cycles are quite hard to stomach if you don't have that long-term view. So I think I want to open with that first because there's a lot of discussion over the past few years about investability, and even frankly more recently with the rally. Yes, I think allocators are starting to look at China again, but many of them are still having this wait and see approach.
They're not convinced?
No, not completely. They're not completely
convinced, right?
I think a lot of them still remember just a year ago we have experienced something similar where the market rallied And then we all knew what happened for the rest of the year. And they're still drawing that comparison. Is this rally sustainable? Is this time different? And not everyone. I would go on to say majority of people are still not fully convinced.
I think there were at least 3 false flags in the last 18 months to 2 years where managers and investors were looking at this as a trigger point for a rebound, right? But even from our perspective, we've been calling for a bottom roughly about almost a year right now, from July of last year, for different numbers. But the big one was actually in January when the Evergrande news came out on liquidation ordered by the Hong Kong authorities, and the market ate back that really fast. I think it dropped 7 to 10%, and then it rebounded within the week.
Absolutely. And that essentially culminated to where we are today. And I do think that was a bit of a turning point in how the government, essentially the role that the government has played since then, is very, very different. So what I mean by that, if you look at the amount of capital that's been poured back into the market since that drop in January, between the trough, which I would call is basically the third week of January up until maybe early March, there was an estimate given about $50 billion were deployed by the government via different entities, SOEs, be it some of the Huijing Fund, which is essentially the central sovereign fund of China, just so that they can prop up the market. And that is quite different compared to last year when the market started to dip. The government basically sat on their hands. They didn't really do anything. In fact, that was one of the biggest crib, so to speak, of investors is, where's the government? Where did they go? What happened to them? Why didn't they do anything?
But you also have those who pointed out they never projected that they would do something. Correct. But the government's been projecting. Let's take it back a bit, right?
Yeah.
4 years ago at that last 5-year plenum, the government projected that they would be going through a deleveraging cycle, which until further notice, we are deleveraging, which meant tighter monetary policy, stricter controls, and basically routing out all the excess in the public markets and in other areas, which turns out they're quite serious about. And so when it came to January, I think it was in November, they started projecting that they would start to support the markets and they would start to prioritize. But then this time nobody believes it. And so I find it a bit disingenuous for a lot of investors who, when the writing is on the wall, they just didn't take it seriously. And part of it, I guess, historically, the government has always kind of stepped in at some point. But it looks like this time they were quite serious.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, Alvin, you brought up a very good point, because it is a very interesting phenomenon where global investors see that investing in China as a risk because of basically a one-party system and whatever they say goes. But on the other hand, they don't take what the party says seriously. I mean, if there's one thing we ought to learn over the past maybe 5 years, is whatever the party says that they're going to do, they have done.
I tell them it's like, don't fight the Fed.
Exactly. Precisely.
Don't fight the Fed. This is literally a Chinese translation of don't fight the Fed.
Precisely.
And the same type of behavioral finance kicks in where there's this skepticism or this desire to be contrarian for the sake of it.
Yes. And they wanted to transition away from dirty energy into renewables. And look what has happened to the solar renewable sector, EVs. They say they're going to lock down. Well, I mean, they did lock down during the zero COVID period, and everyone was predicting when they're going to open, and they didn't open until they say they're going to open. And then you fast forward to today, when the policy is very clear that they're going to support the economy, they're going to try to prop up the real estate sector, and to promote investments again back into the market. I think we should just take that at face value, and that's exactly what they're going to do.
Right.
So from an investor perspective, in my opinion, it's actually not too difficult to read what the government is doing, because just listen to them, because that's exactly what they have done over the past 10 years now, since basically President Xi came into power.
It feels like they've been transparent, if nothing.
Exactly.
I think what's really interesting right now is you have more and more news of changes, innovative accomplishments, whether it be semiconductor space, which everyone is talking about. The chips manufacturing sector is still reeling from how fast China came out with the 4 and 5 nanometer chips, which most in the West were saying it would take at least 5 to 7 years. They did it in under 3.
Yeah.
right? There was a report that came out yesterday from Bloomberg Opinion, David Bixby, which was remarking at how even in the energy space net right now, in the solar manufacturing space, 7 out of the top 20 companies in energy is actually supplied by Chinese manufacturers.
Yeah.
Particularly in the solar sector, which actually outpace in terms of energy deliverables to the largest of the Chevrons and the Exxon Mobils.
Yeah, and not just solar. You look at even traditional energy, all the way down to logistics. It's a very interesting fact. So there are what we call 18 types of warships that the US Navy uses. Out of the 18 type of warships, only one country can produce all 18 types, and that's actually China.
Really?
In fact, the latest 2 warships that the US Navy actually uses were manufactured in China.
And so they're no longer manufactured now, obviously.
Unfortunately,
But they were.
Yeah, unfortunately, what happened is over the past 20, 30 years, the shipbuilding capability, the Western world basically gave up. They haven't invested enough to catch up, whereas China continued to invest in this space to the point where now they're the number one maker of commercial cargo ships. They dominate 90% of the cranes that get used to lift those cargoes in different seaports.
Wow.
And they control majority of the world trading hubs for shippings. Look at Europe, in Greece, as an example. All these major shipping ports are actually controlled by China. So I do think there's a bit of a situation here where everyone, because of the headlines and everything, they're saying how the West are sanctioning China on its most advanced tech.
Yeah.
While, yes, it is creating a bit of an issue, on the other hand, I think many are also overlooking areas where China are having a significant need. Right before this session, we were talking about connectivity. China is a leader in 5G. They're already deploying 6G.
The news there was incredible. This was about robotics, which is another tenet in your team's investment strategy, right? Leading tech. And for the first time in history, we had a surgeon based in Italy carry out a remote procedure on a patient 8,000 kilometers away in China using nothing but existing fiber optics and 5G technology and advanced robotics to work on the patient. This was done live. This was done on a live feed for the entire community to see, and it was incredible. And what I think most people and investors don't realize the significance is this is not just a reflection on the medical genius that's at work here. It's also not just about robotics technology and how high fidelity it's become.
Yeah.
And remember, these are robotic arms manufactured en masse in China now. But more importantly, about the communication lines.
Indeed.
And this is 5G. This is not 4G. This is 5G.
Yeah, and I was joking that I'm actually surprised that Italy was able to carry on this operation, because it's not a surprise to me that China is able to do this because of its infrastructure.
20 years ago, it would be the other way around.
Exactly.
We'd be sitting here going,
Can China do this? Yeah. But right now it's exactly the opposite. And so related to sort of this infrastructure and connection too, you look at space as sort of the next area of contest around the world.
They just landed on the dark side of the moon.
Second time, and the only nation to do that. By 2030, China will be the only country with a space station, because the current ISS is scheduled to be decommissioned by 2030. So, there are a lot of areas where I think, for whatever reason, it's not quite being reported, and there's a lot of misunderstanding that China is still almost like in this third world type of situation. It's really not. There are so many pockets that China are becoming the leader of the world. And you take a step back from an investment perspective, it actually creates a lot of interesting opportunities.
Oh, it's fascinating, right? Even if you're looking at building a strategy that's going to focus on the leading energy companies, going back to our earlier examples, you need all 7 of those Chinese names in your book.
Yeah.
Because they're competing in the top 20 with the largest names in the world, at least in traditional oil and gas. In your last conference that you're just coming from, you're talking about a really interesting comparison to the turn of the century with what happened with Britain and Germany.
Yeah.
And maybe you can repeat that story for us here.
Yeah. So one of the biggest takeaway from this seminar that I just attended was, so the topic was, what will lead to the sanctioning of China on the most advanced space? Right. I mean, honestly, that's anyone's guess. But if we were to look at history and how that has played out, we actually had a situation at late 1800s, basically at the turn of the century, where Great Britain at the time was doing everything they could to control the rise of Germany via blocking their access to coal. Because at that time, coal is still the dominant energy source.
Yeah.
The end result of that was Germany, not only did it not stop Germany from advancing, Germany basically skipped that step and went directly into oil.
Wow.
And what ended up happening is Great Britain got caught on the wrong foot and they became the laggard instead of being the more advanced nation. And we all knew what happened to Germany after that, leading up to World War I and then also World War II. And in fact, if I recall, the first director of NASA was actually from Germany during the period where all these German scientists were essentially captured and brought over to the US to help them with developing new technology. So you fast forward to today, that analogy, what it will lead to the fact that US sanctioning China, if we were to look at history, it could very well that it forces China to quickly innovate into other areas that can replace the existing technology of manufacturing semiconductors. There's already a development in China, from what I understand, on chiplet technology. So chiplet essentially. So right now in the West, it's all about single chip, having the most advanced computing power. The lower nanometers you go, the more computation you can do because there are more transistors that can put into the chip. So because of the blockade and sanctions of that tech and all the components that go with it, China is quickly branching out into developing chiplet technology using mature nodes. So basically like the 10 nanometers or the 15 nanometers, putting them together so that the sum of the computing power can compete with, let's say, the one chip that is 3 nanometers or below. Right. Which in a way, it doesn't sound very efficient, but it is still...
As long as it's competitive.
But it is competitive.
And as long as it's price efficient on a per kilowatt basis, on per metric basis, you're going to be competitive.
Correct.
It's interesting you mentioned, I saw a similar article last week about they had discovered, or there's a breakthrough in photon technology.
Yes.
Similarly, exact same logic, because of the sanctions, they said, okay, well, instead of silicon-based, let's jump to photon and light-based transistors.
Yeah.
Light-based semiconductors where information travels obviously at the speed of light and you don't have the same physical restraints that you would have with chip design. First of its kind, still needs to be obviously commercialized and mass manufactured, but the tech is there.
Yep. Right. Exactly. And that's, in my opinion, a direct result of China being at sanctions, that they're being pushed against the wall. And they have no choice but to think outside of the box, so to speak, to come up with new ways to get what is needed. I believe sanction only works if the sanctioning party has a indefinite edge in innovation and whatever it is that they're sanctioning. And
if you were to pick one area, which would it be? Like, knowing what you know now, right? Is it the EV space? Is it solar tech? Is it photon resistors? Like, knowing what you know in terms of not just the permutations, but contributions to the economy and how deep the supply chain goes or could potentially be built out of China. Could be rare earths even. If you were to look at it now, which would you pick?
In terms of...
Yeah, which would be the equivalent, analogous to coal to oil in the case of Britain and Germany?
I actually have two that I would pick. And it's very much related to energy and also related to AI. And everyone talks about AI, EV, but not enough people talk about the power that's needed to run these things. You look at, and there are two areas to this. You look at the power grids around the world, they're extremely aged. Europe, for example, 2/3 of its power grid is more than 40 years old. Current global consumption of power is estimated to be about 500 terawatt per hour. In about 2 years, it's estimated to double to 1,000 terawatt per hour, driven by the rise of AI, which then breeds so many data centers, and then of course EV as well.
Yeah,
that's the demand. The supply isn't catching up. Now, you break down, so the power grids globally needs a significant upgrade. When you start breaking down on the different components that make up the power grids, the transformers, the transistors, power cables, and all that stuff, China is the number one manufacturer in every single spot.
I was about to say, I remember reading one of your reports last quarter that they're the number one producer manufacturer of transformers.
Correct.
Which is instrumental to this space as well for AI.
So that's one area, if I have to pick, where that China will essentially lead and really be able to counterbalance, so to speak, of all these sanctions. That's going to be one area. Related to that too is nuclear power. China is able to build a nuclear plant with less than half the time needed than the Western world.
Incredible.
And so talk about cleaning up the economy, ESG, climate change, that's also a big topic. To really shift there quickly, and we're running out of time as we speak, honestly, nuclear power is a very good way to do that. Yes, there's some risk of radioactive waste and so on and so forth, but I do think the benefit outweighs the risk at this point. And China is able to manufacture a plant in, if I recall, about 3 years relative to other Western countries of minimum 7 years.
Wow.
So I would bet that China will also leverage this and start being an exporter of nuclear power to around the world.